Very warm welcome to everybody. I'm super excited about this session. It's taken a little bit of time to come together, but back in August, we invited the first of a series of guest contributors to start thinking about and writing a guest blog for us around about the Disability Discrimination Act. Some of these people I've known for over 30 years when the Act was first legislated, and in fact, at that time I was working as the Housing Services Manager for the Royal National Institute for the Blind, a mixture of policy, advice and campaigning, probably what we call influencer now, with a youthful Neil Crowther at my side. So we've worked very much in this space for many years, and it's a real delight that we're able to pull together this happy hour with all the contributors who are able to make it today. And unfortunately, we had one or two due to illness and other circumstances aren't able to make it. But we're delighted that we've got a stellar cast for you this afternoon. And the intention here is for each of our contributors to talk for 4 or 5 minutes, a bit about the blogs that they've written, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers, as well as a panel debate based on their contributions, both today in this webinar, but also from their blogs. So the order of the day is we've got Catherine Casserly, a barrister specialised in equality, human rights and employment, very much linking into things like the Equalities and Human Rights Commission and the Disability Rights Commission. And it's lovely to have you here. You and I go back, probably back to those 30 years ago or so.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, great to be here, Jeremy. Thank you for the invitation.
Lovely, and we look forward to asking you to speak shortly. Julia Lawrence, who's stepping in at very short notice, but delighted that Julia could be here instead of Diana and Paula from the University of Stirling, and one of the leading lights of the ISPA project, the intersectionality between ageing and the built environment, including people with disability. Gary, lovely to have you here. You wrote our second blog, member of Engagement League, but also importantly, co-founder of Learning Disability England. Christina McGill will be joining us from Have and Take Housing Association, and then we've got two great heavyweights, if I can call it that. Sir David Pearson, who I worked with and for when I was at the Department of Health, independent chair and advisor. He probably needs no introduction, but I'll leave it to him to give his stellar background. And Emma, we are ever so pleased that you're able to join us. You're recently imposed as the Disability and Access Ambassador for Housing. You've been Chief Executive of Eastlight Community Home for a bit longer, but thanks very much for joining us, and also at fairly short notice writing a blog and agreeing to contribute to this happy hour. So I think rather than hearing me talk for the next hour and a half, we are really pleased to kick off. And I'm going to ask Catherine to introduce herself and to start the session proceedings. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yes, my name is Catherine Casserly. I'm a barrister at Cloisters Chambers, and I work primarily in discrimination, employment, human rights law. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've got, as Jeremy said, about 5 minutes to set the context, hopefully, for the other excellent speakers that you're going to hear this afternoon. I'm going to talk a bit about the DDA, equality law, and how we got to where we are now, and a little bit about what the future might hold. In 1995, I was a lawyer in an advice centre in a psychiatric hospital when the Disability Discrimination Act was first enacted. And as you'll probably be aware, it was the first piece of legislation to provide basic non-discrimination rights to disabled people. So it really was a milestone at the time. And I was able to use it to very great effect, not only at that law centre, but also RNIB, where I also worked. Very good place to be. And it was there that I gained, in fact, the first injunction under the Disability Discrimination Act, requiring a restaurant to admit a blind customer with their guide dog. Although I wasn't quite sure why they wanted to go back to that restaurant, because I'm not sure the food would have been particularly good when they did. But it was a piece of legislation that obviously gave people rights before where they had none. It did, though, have very significant flaws in it, and that perhaps wasn't surprising, as it had been rushed through in order to avoid a much more generous private members' bill from being passed, because there was such support in Parliament at that time for disability rights. So there was no provision in the DDA for reasonable adjustments in housing. There were no obligations on public authorities, including local authorities, in their housing allocation functions, not to discriminate. But those flaws were remedied by the DDA 2005 after much lobbying, including by the Disability Rights Commission. And so that introduced a disability equality duty on public authorities. You'll probably be aware of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, institutionalised race discrimination, and that introduced the first equality duty in relation to race, and that was carried across to disability. Reasonable adjustments in housing were introduced, and public functions were subject to discrimination duties in relation to disability. And then we had the Equality Act, so consolidating legislation, adding some elements to disability discrimination, and one public sector equality duty across all the protected groups. So what impact has that had in the housing field? Well, I think there have been some very significant successes, though really I would say only since the enactment of the Equality Act, because initially I think it was used very sparingly, in fact, in housing. There was a particular case in the Supreme Court, Ackerman, Livingston and Astor communities, a case that I was fortunate enough to be instructed on, which made it clear that disabled people have additional rights in a housing context, particularly in relation to eviction, and that landlords had to justify treatment which was unfavourable and which was because of something arising in consequence of disability. And what that case did was put to bed a case called Malcolm, which had been taken under the Disability Discrimination Act and which was disastrous in the context of disability. And since then, I think the Equality Act has been regularly used to defend evictions based on disability-related reasons, including matters relating to antisocial behaviour and also for rent arrears and relating to benefits, although I know that's going to be addressed by the Renters' Rights Act. It's also resulted in some very significant damages, money, for disabled people who've been evicted on the basis of accusations of antisocial behaviour. In the public sector, it's had an impact as well. So the public sector equality duty, reasonable adjustment provisions used to challenge housing allocation determinations, as well as housing allocation schemes. So there's been a significant impact there. But there remain very significant flaws in the provisions. So the public sector equality duty is, again, as you'll probably be aware, it's very much focused on process and not outcome. So long as due regard has been had in substance to the limbs of the public sector equality duty, it is for the decision maker to reach the decision and not for the courts to interfere. And that was seen, for example, in the judicial review around PEEPs. So again, as you'll be aware, the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 1 report made a recommendation in relation to PEEPs. The government decided not to take that recommendation up. There was a judicial review of that, and included in the grounds of that judicial review was that there'd been a failure to have due regard to the public sector equality duty. That challenge failed, and what the court said was that the defendant, the government, had understood that a failure to implement the recommendation would have a disproportionate impact on those with protected characteristics. But because it had understood that, it had complied with the equality duty. As well as the flaws in the equality duty, the housing duty to make reasonable adjustments is very limited. It's focused on an individual, so it's not anticipatory as it is in relation to services and functions. And there is no obligation to alter physical features. And that's been made very clear even in relation to local authority housing. The duty in relation to common parts hasn't been implemented. And there are fundamental difficulties in enforcing rights in the county court. So what of the future then? It is important, in my view, that rights that we have at present are used to their fullest. And I think they still aren't. There is still very low awareness amongst people and duty holders of the obligations that they have under the Equality Act. But the law that we have, in my view, in relation to discrimination, including the public sector equality duty, isn't as fit as it should be for the purposes that it has. The law that we have doesn't meet, in particular, the needs of disabled people. There are flaws across the protected characteristics, but I think particularly in the context of disability. And I think it needs to serve people better and make for effective and lasting change. And that's something that I and others are working on, particularly in this 30th anniversary year. I hope that's been a useful trot through of where we've come from, where we are, and where we might be going. And I'm going to hand back now to Jeremy. Thank you.
Catherine, that was more than just a trot. That was a good canter through, but also you set it out very clearly and succinctly, and also set the groundwork really well for all our other contributors whose blogs will touch, I'm sure, on many of the points that you've raised. But also, I've left with sort of thinking you've also got this sort of way forward as well, and hopefully we can explore a bit of that. And I'm delighted that your blog now is in our chat for people who haven't had a chance to read that. Well, somebody who's also been looking at this for many years, both from a built environment and from a broader perspective, is Andy Shipley. And Andy actually kicked off our series of blogs. And his presentation is based on his blog, A Tale of Two Duties. So again, that fits in quite nicely with what Catherine was talking about, Andy. So I'm going to hand over to you. You've got 4 or 5 minutes. And there was a chat point, if I'll give you a minute or so warning as we near the end, okay?
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Yep, as you say in my blog, and particularly the paper that it was based on that I wrote for the Sensing Climate project, which I'm currently researching for University of Exeter, sought to describe the significance, the significance of the DDA, in particular the Disability Equality Duty, for establishing a strong legal framework which established the embedding of the rights of disabled people in policy, shaping of policy and implementation of policy. The kind of progress we really saw really tangibly in such initiatives as the Code for Sustainable Homes, which the Labour government introduced in 2008, which incorporated requirements relating to climate environmental standards alongside those for accessibility, which would have seen all tenures of housing being built to lifetime home standards by 2013. So quite a long time ago. I don't really need to tell you what happened to the code after the 2010 general election of the coalition governments. And in my blog, I spoke about the Equality Act and more specifically, the replacement of the Disability Equality Duty by the Public Sector Equality Duty. So I won't really rehearse any of that. But I just want to use my time here to focus on one example of how this change has really impacted with very real world consequences on the lives of disabled people. In 2011, the coalition government commissioned the Local Government Association to produce guidance for managers of purpose-built blocks of flats called Fire Safety in Purpose-Built Blocks of Flats, which is otherwise known as the LGA Guide. And it was intended to really clarify the role of building managers in relation to fire safety law. And this is what the LGA Guide said. Sally, could you show slide 1, please, and perhaps read it if possible, just in case anybody isn't able to see it.
Sally's moved the slide on, but what I'll do is I'll read it for you, Andy. Paragraph 79.9 provides that in general needs blocks of flats, the physical and mental abilities of the residents are likely to vary, but suggests that it's usually unrealistic to expect the responsible person to plan for that or to have in place special arrangements, such as a personal emergency evacuation plan. And then it goes on, paragraph 79.11 states that the case of a general needs block is not realistic to expect the responsible person to hold information relating to residents with mobility or other conditions affecting their ability to escape in a way that enables it to be made available to the fire and rescue services. And that's the end of the quote, Andy.
Thanks, Jeremy. And it perhaps comes as no surprise that the LGA Guide was drafted without any input from disabled people or disabled people's organisations. But many years on, the Grenfell Tower inquiry came to very different conclusions about the need for person-centred risk assessments and personal emergency evacuation plans. And the conclusions they arrived at are on slide 2. Again, if somebody could read that out for me, that would be fabulous.
Yeah, I'll continue reading it out. And Sally's now moved that slide on. Those whose ability to evacuate the building without assistance should be provided with personal emergency evacuation plans. And the next quote is, we do not think it is impractical for the responsible person to make available to the fire and rescue services by digital or other means reliable information about those with chronic disabilities whose ability to evacuate the building without assistance in an emergency.
Thank you, Jeremy. And in July this year, the government actually accepted those recommendations and revised the regulations to make provisions for the provision of person-centred risk assessments and personal emergency activation plans. Slides 3 and 4, please.
Okay, I'll read this one out as well. The
Thank
first
you.
one of these says the Fire Safety in brackets Residential Evacuation Plans England Regulations 2025 aim to improve the fire safety and evacuation of residents in specified residential buildings in England who would have difficulties evacuating a building by themselves in the event of a fire in brackets relevant residents. This may be due to a physical mobility issue, some other disabilities such as having a sight or hearing impairment or cognitive condition. And then it says the regulations also mandate building emergency evacuation plans in these buildings. And then the next slide says, do you want me to read this, Andy?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a series of bullet points. The residential PEEPs process includes a suite of measures. The first one, the responsible person, typically the building owner or manager, identifying residents who need residential PEEPs, a person-centered fire risk assessment, a conversation between the responsible person and the resident, if one is requested by the resident, to understand their particular risks and identify how their fire safety and evacuation can be improved. The next bullet point, and an emergency evacuation statement of what the resident should do in the event of a fire, in brackets if agreed between the responsible person and the resident. Next bullet point, information for the fire and rescue authority to help inform any operational response and in the case they need to undertake evacuation, but only if the resident explicitly agrees to that information being shared. And the last bullet point, an ongoing duty to review the person-centered fire risk assessment, emergency evacuation statement, and the building emergency evacuation plan.
That's a mouthful. Thank you. Yeah. So just to be clear, really, it took the deaths of 15 disabled people in the Grenfell Tower fire to bring about a reform to the fire safety regulations and perhaps a change of government to require building owners to undertake person-centred fire risk assessments for disabled and vulnerable residents. If the Equality Act had any influence at all, it would be to the extent to which it permitted the persistent neglect of disabled people, of the fire safety needs of disabled people at both national and the local level, with the tragic consequences that we saw play out in Grenfell Tower. However, when it comes to wider emergency preparedness policy and action from local resilience forums, there's a bit of catching up to do. In its guidance for local resilience forum, the identifying and supporting persons vulnerable in an emergency, the Cabinet Office has published this advice. And this is the last slide, I think.
I shall read it now. It may be unrealistic. It may be unrealistic for many LRFs to have any other approach than compiling a list of data holders, as data will change too frequently to have a single compiled list of vulnerable persons. And that's HM Government 2025. And this is a document called Identifying and Supporting Persons Who Are Vulnerable in an Emergency.
So that very much echoes the wording in the LGA guide, Fire Safety Purpose-Built Box of Flats, unfortunately. And nowhere does the guidance recommend or even recognise the value of personal risk assessments and personalised emergency plans. Without such a person-centred approach, there's a great risk that disabled people will continue to fall through the cracks. We can only pray that we don't see further tragedies in extreme weather events, for example, for emergency preparedness policymakers to see the value of person-centred risk assessments and personal emergency plans in protecting the lives of disabled people. Were the disabled disability equality duty requirements still in place, coupled with the Secretary of State duties to drive and report on progress towards disability equality in their policy sectors, it's questionable whether this situation would have been able to persist for so long. And that's it. Thank you.
Andy, many, many thanks. And that follows really neatly from what Catherine was illuminating as originally. So a great double act, actually. And in fact, you also are speaking before Julia Lawrence, and only last week, ISPA Project published a report that they've been doing on fire safety as well. So we may put that in the chat, but we'll put your blog in the chat as well. Many thanks for joining us, and please stay on, and we'll have a Q&A and discussion group later on.
Thanks,
well, Julia,
Jeremy.
can I thank you very much for stepping in at fairly short notice, but please do pass our best wishes and speedy recovery to Diane and Paula. Over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I am hoping that you're going to be able to see my slides that I have created. So I will start now. So good afternoon. I'm here today on behalf of Dr. Diane Theakston and Paula Rogers, who unfortunately, due to illness, aren't able to be here today. Together, they co-authored a very powerful blog marking 30 years since the Disability Discrimination Act, and I'm going to be sharing some of their reflections with you today. I really hope that I can do their words justice, because what they've written is both personal and also very deeply insightful. So their blog begins with a simple but powerful question. 3 decades on, how much has really changed? And at the time, the DDA was a landmark step towards equal rights for disabled people. But as Diane and Paula have reminded us, rights on paper don't automatically become rights in practice, especially when things like age, place, and stigma are actually overlapping in daily life. So, as you can notice, I'm not Diane and Paula, I'm Julia Lawrence. I'm the project coordinator of the Intersectional Stigma of Place-Based Ageing Project, or ISPA as we call it for short. Both Diane and Paula are also part of the ISPA project, and it's a 5-year, £2 million study funded by the ESRC, and it's running from 2022 until 2027. So the ISPA project explores how age, disability and place intersect, and how stigma shapes people's experiences as they grow older or live with long-term conditions. And we're working with around 140 community peer researchers, or CPRs, of which Paula is one of them. And these are older and disabled adults from across the UK, and they act as our kind of co-researchers. They're not subjects, they're co-researchers. And they're shaping every stage of the project. The questions we ask, the methods we're using, how we share our findings, and their lived experience keeps us kind of grounded, essentially. And at the heart of ISPA, we have one big question. What happens when someone is growing older, living with a disability, and also living in an area facing social and economic disadvantage? And how do these forces combine? And crucially, how can we actually intervene? And that brings us back to the blog that we're sharing today, because that highlights exactly why we need to understand this kind of intersectional analysis to understand real people's experiences. So in the blog, which is available on the HousingLIN website, Paula shares her story, which she entitles "Don't Box Me In." Now at 21, Paula had a spinal cord injury, and she had to adapt from being able to walk, being able to work, to using a wheelchair full time. Paula quickly discovered that her historic market town that she lived in also, it wasn't built for, or it wasn't adapted for physical disability. When she left hospital, she returned to her childhood flat. She found 13 steps up to the landing, 5 more to the front door. She was on a steep hill. So she mentions, you know, by the time that she actually got to her physiotherapy, she was already exhausted. So she then went on to try and apply for accessible housing. The online system wouldn't even process her. So she had to put in a kind of make-believe date that she was born in 1900. Now, why was this? Now, this was because accessible homes were reserved for people that were aged kind of 50, 60 years old and over. At 21, she felt, and in fact actually was, invisible. So after years of waiting and living in unsuitable housing, she got a bungalow, and she's got a wet room within that bungalow. While she says that it's perhaps not perfect, you know, she finds that her powered wheelchair only just fits through the doors, it is somewhere that she can call home. However, when she goes into her local community, she noticed things like many of her local shops remain inaccessible, steps at entrances, or there's narrow aisles. People assume, actually, you're going to send your carer in rather than come yourself. And she comments that when winter snowdrifts block her road, she jokes it's like living in Hotel California, lovely to look at, but hard to leave. And don't worry, I'm not going to break into song or anything. So, but stories like what Paula and what Diane, our project, ISPA project researcher, experiences are. Diane is registered blind. They show why things like the DDA and later the Equality Act, they're never going to be the end of the story. Because accessibility isn't just about, you know, putting a few ramps in there or buses, and it's about dignity, it's about independence, and it's about being able to participate in community life. So when disability intersects with age and place, and in this example, sort of an older built environment, these barriers start to multiply. And that's why ISPA uses this intersectional lens. We've got to look at how inequalities connect rather than treat them as being separate issues. So please, you'll see on the screen, visit our project website. You can type the URL in, scan the QR code. That should take you to our website. It's hosted by our lovely folks here at HousingLIN. So finishing off, essentially, 30 years on after the DDA, we've made progress, but not parity. Diane and Paula, as they've put it in their blog, the fight for equality is not over. It's lived every day, and it must be acted on together. So the question for us all is, how do we design towns, services and systems that don't box people in, but open doors? And that's the heart of ISPA's work, and why lived experience will always be our guide. So thank you for listening today. Diane's contact details, as well as our PI Vicky's, are on the screen. So yeah, thank you for listening, and I'll attempt to stop sharing my slides.
Julia, thank you very much, and you really captured what they wrote really well. And while we couldn't have them with us this afternoon, lovely that you were able to share the spirit of what they're talking about and articulate that. And here at the LIN, we're very proud to host the ISPA website and be part of this 5-year project as well. Well, somebody who also has lived and bred co-production, co-design, and in his case, co-founding the Learning Disability England is Gary. Gary, we're so pleased that you could join us. You also have been in this space for many years. And I think when we caught up last week, you said you've also recently moved, and that's transformed your life as well. So I'm going to hand over to you, Gary. Welcome aboard.
Thank you very much. Yes. I'm Gary Borley. I've been a self-advocate for 37 and a half years, and I've founded People First in 1984, and in 2016 I founded Learning Disability England. So that is sort of we're an organisation that's not just people with learning disabilities, but we have family members and also providers. So we work together on as a movement, working together. The the DDA was a significant moment to protect people in law for the first time, but especially for people with a learning disability. A lot of people didn't have a voice, and we were sort of far behind other disabilities. People started taking rights about disabled people seriously when the DDA came out. The biggest thing for me was it introduced reasonable adjustments, and I couldn't have done the work I'd done without reasonable adjustments. And that is helped me keep myself in work. It was also a stepping stone for future legislation, like for instance, valuing people. This was came out during Tony Blair's government, and so that was to help to improve people with learning disabilities' lives and give people more freedom and power in that. But that was taken away as soon as the coalition government came in. And also the legislation led to access to work. Access to work was really just for people with physical disabilities, not for people with learning disabilities. And it was that came about for people with learning disabilities later in life. It was to help people in work, adaptations, and also for personal assistance as well, which that has helped me. It's though it's all been absorbed into the Equality Act, and I think it lost some of its focus, the DDA, when it was gone into that, into the Equality Act. But we are in a better place now than we were 30 years ago. Lots of progress was made. Not as quick as I would like. I would have liked a lot more done, much, much quicker, because for people with learning disabilities, it's been ages and it's taken so long to get the freedom, getting out of long stay institutions and asylums, and able to have your own home, your own job, and not to be stuck in day centres, which I have happened to me. I was in a day centre for 6 years. What I would like to see in the future, example, is more people living good lives. We have a good lives framework at Learning Disability England, and I ask you to read that. But I would like to see good lives producing real jobs, real careers, real wages, with benefits not to be used out as an out of work benefit, but an in work benefit. That's what I would like to see. That concludes my presentation.
Gary, that was absolutely fantastic, and thanks ever so for your contribution. We're going to come back to many of the points, and I don't know if you can see, but you're getting lots of thumbs up and hearts on the screen, which are reactions, for those of you who can't see the screen, to people's comments, and these have been appearing right throughout this happy hour. So well done, and to you and the team. And again, the LIN has been very privileged to work with you and the Learning Disability England on a number of housing projects, and I see Claire Skidmore from NHS England is with us as well, so fantastic to see you. Now, there was reference earlier to the words sustainable development and lifetime homes, and somebody who's worked very closely on thinking about the design and the future design of housing for people with disabilities, including people who use wheelchairs, is Christina McGill from Habentech. And Christina wrote a blog which really, I think, sums up a lot about where we in the housing sector are. So, Christina, I'm going to ask you to share your screen, or you are, and to kick off.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much, Jeremy, and it's really great to be part of today's meeting. I've entitled my my blog and this little few minutes as "No More Scrubbing the Front Doorstep," and that is because way back in 1999, is this going to move along? Let's see if I can make the presentation move.
Oh, sorry, Christina, I've got your slides up on screen.
Oh, you're doing it.
Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah,
Or did you want
yeah.
me
If you want to go to the first one with the picture, that would be great.
There we go.
All right, you know what I'm going to do? I just need to stop share. I thought I was sharing, so I'm going to just open up again. And where's stop share? No, that's fine. I can see now. Yes. So back in 1999, when I was then working at Scope, the disability charity, I remember one day when on the front page of the Times, there was a photo a bit like this one of a 1950s lady in her pinny on her hands and knees, scrubbing the front doorstep of a black and white in a black and white photo on the house. And the phrase on that headline, as I recall if I recall rightly, was something like "the demise of the great British doorstep." And that article had been placed by the National Home Builders Federation in response to the fact that Part M of building regulations was coming in, and within that, one of the leading components was. Bear
with us.
Ruth is saying you can't see the.
Yeah, Sally, can you able to move the slide on?
Yeah, I'm not sure what's happened here actually. Let me try and reshare. Can you see that from the beginning?
I can just see a HousingLIN logo there.
Here we are. We now got the picture of a black and white picture. Is that the one you're referring to, Christina?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, please do describe it for those people who are sighted.
So there we've got the lady with her pinny with a bucket scrubbing the front doorstep. And the Times at the time was saying basically they thought that, or the position of that article was that the British front doorstep was something to be defended at all costs against the ravages of accessibility, which was going to disrupt what we all know and love in the face of front doorsteps. And I guess in my blog I was hoping that the person who wrote that, given that it's quite a long time ago now, 30 years, maybe now they're beginning to understand why accessibility in housing is a good thing. I think there's something going, hang on, I'm really sorry, Jeremy. I think I have messed up somehow by attempting to share my own slides, and maybe I need to...
Do we both stop screen sharing and start again?
That's what I was just trying to look for.
So I've stopped.
I'm not actually sharing, so if I press share now and it transfers to mine, maybe that's better that I can take control of it. Is that okay? Shall I try that? What have we got now? So
I've stopped screen sharing. I can just see the start of your presentation now from the tab that I think you were sharing from.
Okay.
So I can see you move your mouse around, for example.
Okay. All right. Let's see then if I can move
if you move it one on, you should be okay. And Jacquel's just pointed out you're on the landing slide, the first one.
Yeah.
I think Christina,
sorry, guys. I'm just trying to find the one that I can actually. I was practicing with this earlier and it was all fine. Has that moved on? Yay. Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Right. So there she is. So, and the Part M document, which has now popped up on the screen as well, back at that time, was really just focused on all types of buildings. And when I looked into it last week, it was very predominantly around, there was quite a lot about thresholds and not too much about any other aspects of access, to be honest. And Jacquel will know a lot more than I do about the detail of that. But what really struck me about with this headline was the DDA had come in 4 years earlier, but still the media there is like thinking, well, what really has disability access got to do with most of us? It's really an unnecessary thing. So that was how it started. And I've got a picture here now of how it's going now. And this is a picture of some steps leading into a very new house that's just been built around the corner from where I live. I've put a coffee cup into the photo for scale. But what it shows is that from the pavement to the small curtilage of the dwelling, there's an upstand of about 3 centimetres. Then there's a 1 metre landing. Then there's another upstand of about 12 centimetres, a very even shorter landing, and then another quite significant threshold where the front door actually is. And so my query is, if Part M of building regulations is doing its job and bringing in those level thresholds, I do not understand why that particular property has received its planning permission from building regulations. There's a little close up there as well to show a bit more about that. So, you know, we have come some way, but clearly not all the way, even that very initial document was intending to happen. Habinteg has been kind of tracking the impact of Part M of building regulations since the regulatory pack was sort of expanded to offer us M42, which, as Jeremy mentioned, lifetime homes earlier, and M42 was is roughly parallel to the lifetime home standard and was based on it. And we've been looking at local plans recently to see what the impact of that is and how it's being used in local plans, because local authorities have got the responsibility for saying how many of these homes need to be built. And what we can see from this map graphic on this slide is that there is a massive regional disparity in the ambition for building homes to this standard. So this, remember, is an accessible and adaptable mainstream standard. It's an inclusive standard. It's not a specialist standard in any stretch for disabled people. But we're seeing that in London, the local plans as they're written suggest that 1 in 24 new homes over the next 10 years could be to that standard. Whereas in the Northeast, the proportion is way, way lower. It's like 1 in 184. So that's kind of where we are with those homes. When you look at wheelchair accessible properties, the disparity is even more alarming, if you like. So that's the M43 standard for those of you who aren't so familiar with Part M. And for wheelchair users in London looking for a new home over the next 10 years, you've got a 1 in 210 chance maybe of getting one. In the Northwest, the figure, if you look at the local plans as they're written at the moment, is 1 in 2006. Now, Habinteg and many others will observe that there isn't likely to be that amount of a disparity of the need for wheelchair accessible properties between those two regions and the other regions in between. So where do we want to get to? A couple of pictures here of the kinds of, I've used the sort of threshold as a bit of a kind of allegory. Obviously, the thresholds are not the only thing about accessible housing, but because we started with thresholds, I've just carried on with pictures of that type. But here's a couple of images of some recent Habinteg properties. One's in London and one is in the Midlands. And that is, we want to see much more of the new housing stock being built to these accessible standards. How do we think we can get there? So, building on the spirit of the DDA really and bringing that up to date into housing, we really need that national baseline. Forget the scrubbing the front doorstep. We need to have that completely out of our frame of reference. And we need M42 to be the new baseline for all new homes. So that would be a change of building regulations. And we really need to make sure that every local plan in the nation is making a proper allocation for some of the new homes to be wheelchair accessible to the M43 standard. And if they don't, we think whether we should just start them on 10% and see how they get on. But underpinning that, as we've seen from that picture of the property that's around the corner from where I live, it's just so important that the right training and dissemination is done around all these policy changes, because without experts and professionals within the housing sector and the built environment sector generally, understanding what is required, why it's required, and how it can be delivered on sites of all kinds, we're not going to see the consistent change that we really want to arrive at. And especially for Jaquel on the call, who was the author of this amazing book, The Inclusive Housing Design Guide, is really, if any of you are in this, working in this arena, this is a really great volume that will give you some of that what, why, and how of all the standards, and how to deliver them really well, and go even beyond building regulations to create something that's really accessible and inclusive to everybody. So that is what I wanted to say, a quick tour of the doorsteps from start to where we are now. Thank you, Jeremy.
Oh, thank you. And I think I very much hope we'll come to quite a few of the things that you've touched on, in particular, bearing in mind that the Social and Affordable Homes Programme was launched last Friday. And we can think about, what this means, not just for our affordable housing sector, but also what the repercussions might be beyond that as well. So thanks ever so for that. We've had two contributions as part of the guest blogs who have also looked at design, one in terms of their own personal experience of following a road traffic accident around accessibility. Unfortunately, Guy can't be with us today, but do have a look at his blog. And a long-standing occupational therapist who many of you will know, Kate Sheehan. She also has contributed a blog to our series, and I've asked her to look at it through the sort of the lens of adaptations as well. So again, there's some real key issues there that do welcome comments back from delegates and attendees on those, but we'll put the links up to both of those blogs in the chat box as well. Well, somebody who's lived and worked housing, although probably through adult social care and health a lot more in his professional life, but as a director of adult social care, probably was very pivotal in thinking about housing as part of a community response, is David Pearson. So David, an independent chair and advisor, probably needs no introduction, but David, I'm really pleased that that you're able to contribute at short notice, but also that you're able to join us this afternoon. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and I'm delighted to be able to join you too, and to follow some fantastic presentations which help to add some colour and light to this important topic. Although Jeremy's right about my background in this capacity, and just to say a couple of things that I've done is I've been a senior intervener for people with a learning disability, helping people who've been in systems with people who've been in hospital for a very long time with a learning disability, to see if we can enable people to live in the community in a place that they call home. And a few of us have done that nationally. But I've also previously been a co-chair of a social Sky project on commissioning housing, health and care back in 2021 with Paul Burstow and Julian Mayer as co-chairs. So I've had, as Jeremy says, a bit of an interest in this area. But in this context, I am part of a Learning Disability and Autism National Housing Coalition, which effectively started to get together about a year ago with a roundtable with government. And it's that I refer to in my blog, Why Adapted Housing is a Right, Not a Privilege. And of course, that statement is not necessarily entirely accurate for the reasons that Catherine identified, in the sense that whilst people can have to follow a process to follow their legal responsibilities, the outcomes, we still have some way to go. It's not to say that progress hasn't been made over the last 30 years, because not much longer than 30 years ago, there were about 30,000 people with learning disability and autism living in institutions. And today in England, we have just over 2,000 in assessment and treatment units, some of whom have been there quite a long time, and I'll come on to that. So it was quite, I was just doing a bit of quick research whilst I was preparing for this, and I was struck by a statement by Lord Holmes of Richmond, who is a Paralympian of some repute, who said, after the 20th anniversary, barriers to the full participation of disabled people still persist. Many disabled people are still locked out of full participation in society due to barriers remaining in the provision of housing, transport, leisure facilities, education and workforce. And the truth is that to exercise ensure that full participation, it can't just be the absence of discrimination, or indeed it can't just be reasonable adjustments. It's got to be proactive measures by us as a society to ensure that people can fully participate in a way that many people are fortunate to take for granted. And if I just go on to say something about the context of for people with some people with learning disability and autism, and it was great. It's great to follow Gary, who I thought set the context really well. It's fair to say that many of the lives of people with learning disability and autism and their families are being rather devastated by a lack of suitable housing, and it is one of the main barriers. And and that comes across when you see that the alternative experience is being sometimes in hospital for a long time. And our current data, August 2025, tells us that 49% of delayed discharges of people with learning disability and autism are due to lack of suitable housing, the biggest single reason for delay. And we think that government spends, we being the Housing Coalition, which consists of healthcare and housing organisations from across the sector nationally, we think that public money could be spent much better. The government spends over £500 million per annum on this in inpatient costs of people in hospital, 237,000 a year on average, and we need specialist supported housing to address that challenge. So we think the current funding model costs more to the taxpayer than is in the wrong way, and we could get far better outcomes if we spent that money differently. To give you an idea of the numbers in terms of inpatients in this group, with a continuous length of stay of 2 or more years, we're talking about just over 1,000 people, and 590 people with over 5 years. There are also something like 55,000 people with a learning disability in England living with family and friends, including many older carers, indicating significant numbers in urgent need of their own long-term housing solutions. Don't get me wrong, living in family units is fine, but I have to doubt whether actually all the people living there from choice or whether it's necessity because there are no other alternatives. And sometimes those arrangements become unsustainable. Research from the National Housing Federation suggests that supported housing for people with a learning disability and autistic people saves the public purse 856 million every year, including savings for social care. So there's an economic case, but there's also a human misery case. And I'm struck by a couple of people that I've been responsible for working with the systems on, who have spent large parts of their latter childhood and their early adulthood in hospitals, sometimes in locked rooms. Appropriate care and housing can lead to the escalation of needs because people are in an inappropriate place, and often that leads to a deterioration in their circumstances. Finally, we have 5 recommendations that we are currently working with the government on, and I'm pleased to say that the government have established a joint working group with us, and over the next few months we will be ramping up our efforts working with them, but also frankly advocating for this. So we want to ask the government to amend the rent standard, removing the restrictive no public subsidy clause to unlock new funding opportunities across multiple sectors. Ensure that the new social and affordable housing programme has scope to offer more flexible grants in this area. Incentivise and support areas to invest in joint planning and delivery across health, housing and care. And I speak as somebody who's also the head of the partnership, chair of the partnership board for mental health in Nottinghamshire, and one of our big priorities is housing in that area too, because 47% of people in Nottinghamshire as we speak are in hospital because they don't have appropriate housing either. A different cohort of people, but the issues are exactly the same. We need to use the national cross-sector guidance that to have clear and consistent standards for commissioning specialist supported housing. And we need this to be fully integrated into the agenda, into the government's overall housing strategy, because we need to make sure that this is given the dedicated attention it deserves, but is very much part of the nation's expectations about how it meets the differential needs of the people, of the citizens of this country. So we are looking for all the support that we can get from colleagues in this room and more broadly. Interestingly, I attended rough sleeping and housing strategy summit with the minister this morning and spoke for 3 minutes about this. And it is interesting. Her comment was to get this up, to get these sorts of things up and running. That meant the whole of the homelessness, housing, particular needs of people across the country. She effectively told us we needed a continued campaign to raise these issues in the public domain, to make sure this is these issues are central in the electorate's understanding of the needs of people in this country. Thank you, Jeremy.
David, thank you very much. And I think that sort of ongoing campaign and influencing is critical, but also making sure that it truly reflects the voices of people and not just us professionals, because actually, we need to demonstrate why there's important changes. I think a recent select committee, somebody from Disability Rights Commission presented saying, the lack of choice means it could take up to 40 years for somebody to actually get their own home. Christina, you may know the precise quote, but it just demonstrates the lack of choices in there as well. And I think those lack of choices and making it much more equitable is something that, Emma, you're really keen to sort of champion and take forward. So I think it's wonderful that you've been able to join us. And perhaps can I not just ask you to present on your blog, perhaps also if you've made any notes just to reflect on some of the comments you've heard, and then we can open up for discussion a bit more widely. But on behalf of the Housing LIN, real delight that you were able to join us this afternoon. Emma Palmer.
Thank you, Jeremy, and yes, good afternoon, and I'm very pleased to have the invitation. I'm Emma Palmer, as Jeremy says, newly appointed Disability and Access Ambassador for the housing sector. I'm also Chief Executive at Eastlight Community Homes and a board member and chair of the Customer Service Committee at A2 Dominion. So I've been in the sector for a very long time. I'm humbled to be here, that I'm amongst people that are true technical experts and sort of long-standing practitioners, as well as people with lots of lived experience, and that you've all served the cause so well. And marking that 30 years since the Disability Discrimination Act came into force is obviously a moment and a milestone for us really to start to ask, what difference has it truly made to people with disabilities in housing, and what kind of wider built environment? And I think this webinar this afternoon goes a long way to answering some of that. And it's patchy, isn't it? So much of what I will touch on is what others have kind of observed and have covered. Christina talks about some level thresholds, and I'm going to kind of touch on sort of some broader issues around that. And Julia's presentation talked about that kind of relationship between age, disability and place. And I think that's really important in considering kind of how we move forward, as well as others that have offered some really powerful reflections and observations on lived experience. So despite the level ground that's been, or the legal ground that's been laid 30 years ago, what we do know is that accessible housing kind of at a macro level remains far from mainstream. In London, only 3% of new homes meet those accessibility standards. So, to talk to Christina's illustration, and fewer than 1% are wheelchair accessible. And the reason I give you London figures is because we don't actually have an accurate picture for the rest of the country. So it's not just a compliance issue. We've heard today it has profound implications for independence, for health, cost and equity, and people with disabilities too often live in homes that just don't work for them. And, again, many live in unsuitable homes for many years, and in some cases for the whole of their life. And that's, entirely a failing and unsatisfactory in society as it is today. And this is a growing issue. So with an ageing population, we've got a population who have greater and more complex needs. This is not something that will just conveniently go away. And I think that we really have to think about kind of motivation and how to get other people interested. And the point is accessibility is good business. It makes good asset management sense. So to give you some context, at Eastlight, we know that 75% of our customers have at least one disability, and many have more than one disability or those complex needs I've just referred to. So it's a whole industry that the social housing sector creates of retrofitting aids and adaptations. It's ridiculously inefficient. It costs the housing association sector, who have not got money to spare. It costs us many millions of pounds. And importantly, we exacerbate the issue of people living for longer periods of time in unsuitable homes. Adaptations are exactly that. People's homes are knocked about to kind of bodge things, fit things in. Equipment is often in the way of general living, and adaptations, they don't look attractive. And you're only motivated to do it when you really have to. So designing things at the front end makes good commercial sense and logical sense. And that's a real critical point that we need to push in order to get house builders and developers engaged and involved. Homes designed for everyone perform better. They adapt easier and are more flexible and agile. They retain their value, and they can support longer tenancies. What I've learned very quickly in this role is that we are underdeveloped as a sector. And there's a question in the chat about social housing lettings. And I think it just demonstrates the point. We just haven't grasped things as a sector in the way that many other sectors have. You take tourism and retail, for example, many of those and other sectors are much more proactive and have made, a greater impact and much more of a difference. They've recognised the commercial sense in doing it too. So the Purple Pound is worth £445 million to the UK economy. So we need to start thinking smarter as a sector. And in my role as the Disability and Access Ambassador, I want to bring together all those parts of the housing system. So I've talked about developers and house builders, private rented sector, all landlords, local authorities, as well as health and social care partners and people with disabilities, to kind of identify what's working, the barriers that we still face, and sort of practical early actions that we can take. What I've seen already, and again, there's true examples on this webinar, is many people are doing some really fantastic work, and they are often, in almost all circumstances, doing that without a connected or supported network. And I'd like to change that. I'm hoping to run 2 workshops where I hope to try and start to connect people and share the work. And I'd love to extend that invitation to those here today, one in person at the end of November, the 28th, and the second online on the 2nd of December. And so if you're interested, you'd like to come and understand that great work, then, please do drop me a line. But equally, I'm really keen to understand what else is out there. These events are really useful for me. I learn much more than I give, I'm certain. So invite me if there are things that you think I can usefully do in this role. So I'll finish by saying, for me, in short, disability inclusion is not a favour for a few. It's the foundation of what I believe is a fair and safe and a sustainable housing system. I think we need to stop treating accessibility as if it's an afterthought or an add-on or indeed an adaptation to a general needs service. And we need to make it the measure of our success. So, you know, to kind of seize the 30-year milestone to commit to embedding accessibility would be great. So I think I'm last, and thank you, Jeremy. And I think we go to discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, and what you've articulated, I know you've sort of brought also out in your guest blog for the HousingLIN, and we'll certainly want to support you in your roundtables and either attend or promote them amongst our broad membership. But you can see that it's something that we in the LIN have sort of got very close to our heart as well. So thanks ever so, and we've now got about 20 minutes or so for a Q&A session. What I would like to do is just kick off by just going through some of the questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And for the purpose of our panel, I shall read these out so that you don't have to worry about finding them. First of all, just to say a lot of comments, very positive comments about all your contributions. So thanks ever so, and I'm glad it's hit a nerve. But I'm going to kick off with Beverly's question. Why are social housing providers allowed to discriminate against disabled people who live with their families when it comes to housing transfers? I've always lived with my son, who has a family now. I've always lived with my son, who has a family now. They have always lived with me. The local authorities say they only have a duty to accommodate me, not my family. I've been living in a property not suitable for me in the last 13 plus years. I'm the person on the tenancy. My son and his partner are my carers. So I think this is not just about our new stock or adapting. It's also, I think, Emma, as you touched on some of it, about our transfer and lettings and allocations policies. And I'm just wondering whether I can ask you and just Christina, perhaps just to reflect on Beverly's comments first.
Yes, certainly. I mean, I pulled that question out because, you know, I think for me that shows kind of how outdated our allocations thinking is. I mean, the reality is social housing stock is in huge demand. And because demand is so high, what happens is we, the royal we, the sector, will look at ways to restrict demand. And as a consequence to that, our lettings become skewed in a particular way. And because we don't think about accessibility and connect it to the different parts of the kind of housing ecosystem, so be it investment, refurbishment, redevelopment, and connect it to demand, those things are hidden. And so I can't answer the question, why as a sector are we able to discriminate? I think the point is pertinent. It points the finger at all of us who are practitioners and says, your thinking, your rules, the way in which you respond is no longer current and it is inappropriate. So I'm supportive of the point. And I think, you know, what I've tried to say is, and what I'm keen to do is really raise awareness of this sort of thing and start to shift and influence in a different way.
I think what you're saying is some of our policies and procedures are inherently discriminatory. Christina, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think there are some pockets of good practice in terms of sort of how local authorities with a little bit more foresight can anticipate needs and manage needs. So that comes anything from thinking about, well, what's your cohort of young disabled children and where are they going to be when they turn into young adults? That's sort of one way of being proactive in this area. But also we've worked in partnership with a couple of local authorities where, for example, there was a large family with maybe one or two disabled members who were of a multi-generational household and had something specific built for those people that could then be remodeled later on when they turned into, you know, maybe no longer needed somewhere so big. So I think local authorities who are well engaged with the needs in their local area and think creatively can actually come up with some good solutions.
And Catherine, you might have a view on this, whether it's something for an ombudsman to look at in terms of their maladministration, or if there's a legal angle here. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just well, two points, I think. And the first is generally with allocation policies, it is possible potentially to challenge them. I mean, as with other functions of authorities, they should be equality impact assessed, and if there are potential adverse consequences for disabled people, who need carers, for example, then that should have been something that was looked at. So it might be possible to take a legal case depending on the particular policy and how it works. That's always something worth looking into. I think the other thing I would say, and this is it's a particular issue with disability. When we talk about discrimination, what people often mean in the context of disability is that there's an adverse impact, or actually what people really mean is that they haven't made adjustments, because that's what you're talking about. Whereas if you're not talking about disability, when you talk about discrimination, you're talking about literally treating someone who's in the same circumstances differently. That's what discrimination is, and they're two different things. And what doesn't happen with disability is that people aren't treated differently when they should be. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why disability discrimination has not fared very well in the context of the Equality Act, because it's a very different type of discrimination to the other types of discrimination. You need to proactively take steps and treat situations differently. And that just doesn't really happen because it goes against the grain for usual discrimination.
Thank you for that.
Kathy, can I come in there? Because
who's that?
Andy.
Andy, welcome. Please do. I'll go to you. And
it just picks up on the thing that I've been talking about, really, and what was lost with the introduction of the public sector equality duty and the repeal of the DED, really, because there was within the disability equality duty, there's a very specific requirement where it was deemed necessary to treat disabled people more favourably, wasn't there, Kathy? Am I correct in that, or am I misremembering?
I'm not sure it was quite that specific.
Paraphrasing.
There is something similar in the public sector equality duty, but I think overall there was certainly a loss. It's not.
But the requirement is no longer to take action, is it? It's just to identify a disadvantage, and you're permitted to take positive action. So if you so choose, rather than actually being required to do so. Is that a fair representation? Right. Okay, we get bogged down in legal, interpretations. Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
I think I'm interested really in practical things as well. So either Gary or Julia through the IPSA project, there are examples here where there are positive ways. I remember back in 2017-18, Christina Habentake worked very closely with the Equality and Disability Rights Commission, developing toolkits which looked at things around allocations and lettings and transfers. And I'm just wondering whether those are things that have been acted upon and helped to inform and develop good practice. Gary, your own experience, or Julia?
Well, from my experience, it's very difficult for people to see that I've got a disability, and you have to convince people that I've got a disability, and it's very difficult out there because and to get the things that you're entitled to. And I'm glad I've moved, but with my niece and my sister, they helped me get this place where I live, which is more accessible than I was in the last place, which I had about 48 steps to climb.
Yes.
By yeah, five flights of stairs, and I ended up with getting mold in my place, in my flat. Here, my health's a lot better. I've got many stairs, and there's a lift in the building, and there's a laundrette, which I don't have to bother about with a washing machine, which helps to live. And got some really nice neighbours, but they're all older than me. That's the only thing. But I get on well with everybody here. So
what you've described also is how to create a resilient system around you, neighbours, community, family, and friends as well. Julia, I'm going to, before I ask David and others to come in, any thoughts?
I suppose back to what Paula's blog said, that there's this assumption that if you're disabled, then you're going to be an older person, and that isn't always the case. So it's about trying to design communities and information, and it doesn't help that across whether it's Scotland, England, Wales, that there are differences in the way that information and how to access support and funding and apply for housing is very different. And I know, speaking from a Scottish context, that then across all 32 local authorities, it's also very different as well. So having some sort of toolkit that helps sort of navigate these would be helpful.
Yeah, and obviously things like building regulations and the code for varying homes and varying needs in Scotland, and the housing quality standards in Wales. There is in the UK there are a number of different approaches. David, from what you've heard around this, any comments?
Yes.
From the coalition.
I do. I have a few comments. I mean, first of all, on the general needs housing point, I helped the North Eastern Cumbria come up with a strategy approach to improve the response for people with learning disability and autism in that area, which has got about 13.5 local authorities. And actually, what was interesting on the general housing needs allocation and prioritisation process was the complete variation in the level of sophistication and degree to which people took proactive steps to make sure that people with disabilities had the right kind of priority and focus. So that was the first thing. So I think there's something about the consistency of allocations process, and there are plenty of people up there with extreme goodwill and wanting to make stuff happen, but that was one of the things they were going to work on. Secondly, I do think that when I reflect on things like specialist supported housing in terms of the coalition, obviously to make it work, to enable people to live their best lives, and some people say glorious ordinary lives.
Yeah.
You do need people to take proactive action, and the reasonable adjustments is a bit of an understatement. You need a proactive, concerted attempt to have co-production at the heart of it, and that's why in the coalition we're absolutely determined that the people with lived experience will be at the centre of what we're trying to do. And secondly, you have to have if you like, a certain person-centred proactive approach to how you best meet people's needs, and those things are not necessarily and the legislation is more, in some cases, more descriptive than prescriptive, but and there's possibly a lack of national direction, and that's where I'm hoping that the housing strategies will include a greater emphasis on this area as part of the overall housing strategy. So a few thoughts there, Jeremy.
That's really helpful, and I think that last piece about the housing strategy that is critical, both in terms of setting the framework, but also Lord Best, I know, was really keen, as was the Older Persons Housing Task Force, that the needs and aspirations of older and disabled adults have a separate chapter within there, as well as woven through other chapters. So it's looked both in the whole, and let's hope that they may come out this side of the end of the calendar year. Look, we've got several other questions I want to try and rattle through, and some great questions coming in. Please do keep them in. We'll try and get through as many. Jane, you've got a couple which have got big thumbs up. One is really going back to the regional perspective. How can we ensure that money is allocated for accessible housing regionally? You then ask about issues around the ARUP research around integrating homes for all. Anybody want to respond initially on either the regional or the ARUP research?
I could say something on the regional front, Jeremy.
Yes, because I know you've done some work with the West Midlands in particular.
We did, yeah. So the West Midlands Combined Authority, which is a group of 7 local authorities in the West Midlands, they've sort of produced a whole disability inclusion strategy across a number of different themes, but housing was central to that. And so we were able to do a piece of work for them just to try and help them think about what needed to go into that bucket, and looking at what we thought their estimated needs and demands would be in their area. So I'm hopeful that the devolved powers and the devolved budget that is going to be coming along regionally will be an opportunity for campaigners in this area to sort of target a different group of people, those kind of elected mayors and their teams, to sort of really highlight, and for local campaigners as well, to have a different kind of anchor point for landing these messages about the importance of planning for accessibility. And the fact that the West Midlands Combined Authority are kind of taking that as their sort of a standard bearing for it, I think is really positive, and hopefully others will kind of look at that and follow along.
Yes, and through the allocation arrangements for the new affordable homes programme, I think 7 billion has been set aside for mayors over the next 10 years, and there is a real drive to make sure that they actually take this on board, and perhaps follow the lead of places like Greater Manchester and others who've set some of this out in their tripartite agreement. David, you wanted to come in briefly as well?
Well, I was just going to make a very similar point, and I was struck by the summit this morning, how many people from the combined authorities were there and actively engaged in this. And of course, they all have a responsibility in this area as part of their broader economic development work. So, and many of the combined authorities, some are obviously older, like Manchester and London, but some of them are relatively new. So I think there is an opportunity there to get for organisations and coalitions such as ours to get alongside the combined authorities to help them and help them with how they might exercise their responsibilities, because I think they're trying to work it out, and therein lies an opportunity. And I noticed Christina is nodding furiously, so I'm glad that at least somebody supports that view.
Brilliant. Does anybody else want to come back on either of those questions? And I see that Jaquel very kindly has put the ARUP research into the chat box for people who are not familiar with it. Thank you for that. Andy, I think once upon a year you worked for ARUP, if I remember rightly, as well. So, or worked with, no?
No, not directly. No.
Oh, not directly.
No.
I thought you had done a little bit of work with them. Okay, let's move on. Again, those issues that came through, and one of the questions, Emma, is about understanding the commercial benefits as a real driver, and I think that hit the nerve for many people. Is there research on this, or have you got figures that you can share, or can we pull some of this out in due course?
Yeah, I haven't got much available easily, so if others know, that would be useful. What I do know is that in terms of disabled facilities grants only, so that issued via local authorities in 2024-25, that totaled 711 million. So that's without any kind of cost of removal, patching, any additional cost of rent loss because of extended void time, so on and so forth. There's an awful lot of figures that I don't have, but even if you just took that basic figure for 24-25 of 711 million, that's an awful lot that we could play with, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think organisations like foundations might have a little bit more information about that in relation to people who are making modifications, improvements to their own home outside of the grant rate system as well. So I think that there is some data there. And I think Centre for Ageing Better have done some work on this, and Jaquel may have some other access. While I'm at it, can I thank Adam for posting some really great information in the chat box. He also asked all the talk is about homes, but there is a wider built environment, and this might also feed into Sam Clark's question. And Sam's got a great new book coming out looking at architecture and place and aging. And Adam says, I was at a talk recently where a man who used a wheelchair said that pavement conditions were so bad that the rattling of his wheelchair as he moved about made his conditions worse. So he now has a powered wheelchair rather than self-propelled. How are panel members working to improve the rest of our urban environment outside the home? So that big thing about the public realm, and I saw earlier that Rose Gilroy also talked about the rurality of issues as well. So any thoughts about that, colleagues? So I'm just going back to my screen, having read. Do you want me to pick on somebody? David,
I could say something just to also, because Jaquel's put a little comment into the chat, but I think what we've heard from working with disabled people consistently, and this came through the engagement we did for the West Midlands Combined Authority and so on, is, you know, an accessible home can still be an isolating place to live, and if it's not in an accessible neighbourhood or one that is friendly to your particular way of getting about. So I think that when we're doing new developments or doing those retrofit projects on a large scale, paying close attention to the accessibility and inclusivity of the environment, the immediate neighbourhood around the estate and the street scene is really important. And as Jaquel said, that is covered in the book as well. So it's another good reason to take a look at it, but really, really critical to be living in an inclusive way.
Brilliant. Now, David, I'm going to ask you to say a few words, and then we're going to bring this to a close. And just to warn everybody, I want everybody just to say one final piece. So after David, we'll go to Gary, and then we'll move on, okay?
Okay, 2 quick points, Jeremy. One is I just want to flip back to the research and evaluation bit and emphasise how important that is. And in my presentation, I talked about the fact that the National Housing Federation had, in terms of the publication of the benefits of supported housing in 2025, flagged up that supported housing can save 856 million a year. So there's a moral argument, but actually we need to convince the commissioners and the Treasury about these things as well. So having real-time research and evaluation, I know the HousingLIN has been a real champion of evidence base in this area, so I'm preaching to the converted really. But the second point is about the last thing about, sorry, well, just remind me what the point was again. I've just lost it. Never mind. We'll move on. We'll move on. I'll come back to it and remember.
Let's move on. We can come back to you, David, in a minute. Gary, did you want to say something, or can I ask you to sum up from your perspective as well in that?
Well, I'd like to see from my side, for people with learning disabilities, helping to co-produce housing, make them environmentally friendly, affordable, and accessible, and able to inspect those houses as well, and see and help with developing the housing plan. So a really big responsibility for people with learning disabilities to get full hands on developing housing.
Yeah, no, great. And I think that's can be added to David's manifesto. I think very, very neat summary there. And the role of access officers and co-producing with local communities is really important. Let me move on to Julia, please, if you've got any final comments you'd like to make.
It just, I suppose, just really going back to what I talked about earlier, that, you know, that we're 30 years on, you know, that progress has been made, but we still, you know, there still are people being left out, you know, and I think that's why the work that that we're doing with ISPA and that everybody in this room is doing is really, really important. You know, it's just making sure that we get, metaphorically and actually physically speaking, everyone through the door, essentially.
Right, thank you very much. And Andy?
Sorry?
Any final comments?
Yeah, I think what I've heard is that there's so much to do. I think perhaps there's a slightly more open door than there has been over the last 14 years. But I think for me, it's really looking at where the fundamental failures of the Equality Act and PSED can be addressed. I think in terms of how Kathy was explaining it earlier in relation to discrimination, and the need to really identify how we can discriminate better in favour of disabled people. And I'd just like to draw your attention to the Railways Bill, perversely, because that's proposing a new duty to address accessibility issues that may affect disabled travellers. So I think there's an in principle admission there that the PSED isn't enough to address issues facing disabled people, certainly in a transport context. And I wouldn't suggest having to amend every piece of legislation accordingly. So something more central in relation to the equality for disabled people, I think, should be the way to go.
Well, thank you, and thank you again for your contribution. Christina?
Yeah, I guess my final shot would be to maybe build on what Andy's just said about that piece of railway thinking. And one of my last meetings with a civil servant from the MHCLG was talking about the upcoming maybe deeper look at the MPPF, and that's one of the tools that we have to make sure that people do better for disabled people. So I think what I'd like to see is a kind of a signal of intent there is to see much more on the face of the MPPF around disabled people's housing requirements and a duty to plan properly for them, and by whatever means. So I think I'd like to sort of leave people with that idea.
Yeah, and that also ties in with Jane's question about working with planners as well.
Yeah.
And David, can I just come to you before I conclude with Catherine?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I wanted to
I'll conclude with Emma before I forget.
Yeah, I wanted to emphasise the point that Gary made about the environment, that actually I think is absolutely right, and that's the best systems across the country do actually consider the wider environment and the circumstances in which people live. But I wanted to leave you with one thought, that 30 years on, we need to move from reasonable adjustments, which actually are about the process as was described earlier, not necessarily the outcome, but from reasonable adjustments to adjustments that produce the right outcomes for people.
Nice one.
And that's the flip that we need in the third decade of the 21st century.
So, Catherine, can you legislate for some of that? Can you craft the right words for us?
Well, I think I can give it a go. I mean, it's interesting, actually. Following on from what David has said, I think my conclusion actually is that when we were looking at legislation, when I was at the Disability Rights Commission, one of the issues that we looked at was whether or not reasonable adjustments was the right formula. And at that point, we concluded it was. I'm not sure that I'm of that view anymore, because I don't think it's worked. And one of the things about the built environment, I have done cases on the built environment, but it's attacking it in a piecemeal fashion, and that's just not good enough. It's not working. It's not the proactive duty it was meant to be, and nor is the public sector equality duty really putting disability at the heart of the critical decisions and the policies and the practices and the procedures that it was meant to do. So I think there's a long way to go, but hopefully we will get there, or future generations will.
Well, that's again part of the Welsh Future Generations legislation, maybe very useful to look at. Emma.
Yeah, I think that point back.
Held on, so let me give you the final word before I start.
No, you're fine. I realise people will want to go and enjoy their evenings. I think that point about critical decision making and kind of how we get this better mainstreamed is a key point for me. And the point about the commercial drivers, I will undertake to really get some decent, consistent figures that we can really start to articulate how people can kind of save efficiently and address the issue, because if that's what motivates, then that's how we'll get change in sectors that are the housing sector, where it is more commercially driven. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, no, and I think that commercial blended with the social value and the social impact, and as David touched on, the health dividend as well, I think there's a real good argument to be made. This is not just about improved choices. This is about giving people the rights as well to decent home, and as David captured, the sort of social care futures as well. So thank you very much. Well, look, on behalf of the Housing LIN, can I thank all of you who attended this afternoon, who presented, for staying on for an extra 5-10 minutes. It's been a real thought-provoking happy hour. Thanks for your contributions. We thank those people who weren't able to join us, the contributors, but we will share this recording as well as the chat and the slides to all the people who registered for the LIN. Can I thank Sally and the team behind the scenes for helping to put this on. If this is the first time that you've joined one of our happy hours, we normally hold them every Tuesday afternoon, and next week we continue looking a bit more at co-design and co-production with the work of local community-led land trusts and co-housing developments across the country, and some of the award-winning practices that have recently occurred in Norwich, Birmingham, and in Dorset. So please do join us again for a future happy hour, but it leaves me just to say goodbye and have a great evening ahead. Bye. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.